All my life, I've struggled with the inertia of depression, a result of my failure to reconcile an event from my childhood so disturbing that it's left me unsure of my own mind, even after 40 years. I have no siblings, and my real mother and father have long since departed, lost to the treachery of an icy road many years ago. Mother, father. When I think of them, my heart should light up with flickering warmth of joyous memories, how I loved them. Yet, when I visit their grave each year, and I look upon the cold gravestone that bears their name, memories of two others corrupt my cherished recollections, two strangers who called themselves Mom and Pop. I've fought my whole life to erase their pale faces from my mind, but now I know I must risk everything to return to my old childhood home, to rid myself of them once and for all. First, you must understand that Mom and Pop, these watchers, were not my parents. Even saying their name conjures the worst images imaginable. Looking out the windscreen of my car, I can see the fateful red sky before me, impatient to devour me. Tonight, I must drive fast to reach my old childhood home before nightfall. As the road races under the wheels of my car, a can of petrol jostles loudly in the trunk. Tonight our journey will end with fire, but first I must tell you how it began. When I was 7 years old, we lived in the suburbs of a small factory town. Our home was the full package. White picket fence, 2 stories and 4 bedrooms. A perfect home with a perfect middle-class family inside. Or should I say, trapped inside. My father was an administrator at the factory, a job he hated but couldn't afford to quit. This unhappiness caused many arguments between my parents, during which I'd hide in my bedroom upstairs. I consoled myself with toys, recreating scenes from movies with police cars whizzing in hot pursuit of some villain, or fighting great wars among the ranks of my plastic soldiers. Despite my attempts at escapism, I remained a sorrowful child with a constant feeling of loneliness, both at home and school. One Sunday afternoon, it was raining hard and my parents were fighting again. I suddenly couldn't take it any longer. I dropped my toys, fell to the floor, and cried my eyes out. A feminine sigh, gentle and sympathetic, surprised me. I had thought I was alone. I turned around and was startled by the sight before me. Blurred through my tears, I could see 2 figures, standing, watching me. This is the moment when you'll think I'm mad, when you might stop listening. But I'm sure of what I saw. A beautiful-looking woman dressed in 1950s attire, with a smile so infectious that I couldn't resist smiling back. Frightened though I was. Next to her stood a man in a blue blazer and slacks, his collar adorned with a bow tie, who smiled with the same wide-eyed delight. They resembled the couples you'd see in adverts for new kitchens in old magazines, and perhaps like the pages of those magazines, they possessed a slightly uncanny 2-dimensional form. I can't remember the precise words they said, as they spoke in a quick murmur that seemed to translate itself inside my head. I only recall that they wanted me to call them Mom and Pop. Strange as it may seem, with them I experienced a level of euphoria and security I'd never known before. Whatever utterances they made echoed inside me, filling me with a sense of love that would send me to sleep, excited at the prospect of seeing them again the next day. In the days and weeks that followed, I soon trusted my new parents to be there for me, more than my actual mother and father. After dinner, I would race upstairs to be with them, so I could hear Pop's adventures tales, or better yet, so Mom could tuck me into bed and read me bedtime stories, all while my real parents shouted at one another downstairs. Nothing, not the bullies that plagued me or my parents' constant arguing, could discourage my newfound joy. Every evening when I returned from school, Mom and Pop would be waiting, waving cheerfully from my bedroom window, with smiles that never faded, until the night they did. One bedtime, as Mom tucked me in as usual, She seemed distracted, like someone is when they have a secret they're desperate to share. That night I had a terrible dream, a nightmare in fact, that saw me lost and alone in a great void. I could see only a black horizon without end, and such was the terror I felt at this that I awoke. It was still nighttime, and it took me a moment for my eyes to adjust to the darkness. At the foot of my bed I could see shapes, first one and then another. I slowly made out their features, and with some fear I recognized that it was Mom and Pop, standing at the end of the bed, watching me. Did they watch me this way every night? Mom and Pop saw that I was awake, and glided towards me, leaning in close. They explained that they had spent all night coming to an important decision about the future of our family. They asked, "Do you want to be with us forever?" The streetlight outside glowed orange, painting their faces with warmth. Their kind eyes shimmered with emotion. How could I refuse? I was a mere outcast at school, a lonely boy without a friend in the world, and here I was, with the two most wonderful people I knew. I can't remember the exact words they said, but I can remember mine, and I can still hear my 7-year-old self fatefully whispering, "Yes." Then I blacked out, and what happened next is a blur. From what I was told, it seems my parents were roused from their sleep by the sound of me rummaging in the kitchen. When they came to investigate, they were shocked to discover me lying on the floor, attempting to force the prongs of a fork into an electrical socket. I have no memory of this, but I remember how upset my parents were and how scared I was when they explained how close I had been to killing myself. They didn't want to leave me alone that night, so they took me to bed with them. As my mother and father hugged and embraced me, I could only think of my bedroom just down the hall, where I considered with dread who would be waiting there at the foot of my bed. I need not have worried, because in the days that followed I did not see Mom and Pop again, neither at the foot of my bed or at my bedroom window as I left for school. This was a golden time for me, and at school I even began making friends, while my parents reconciled the issues that had put their marriage in jeopardy. But one night in October, in the midst of a gale, I awoke to find Mom standing by my bed, concealed in shadow. But for the moment, a flash of lightning illuminated her. She didn't speak, but just watched me with eyes that burrowed into mine. She was smiling as always, but I realized that it was never really a smile. It twisted strangely at the corners. It was a crude mask that hid a grin filled with malicious intent. Enraged by my rejection, I could see that Mom was now relishing the prospect of whatever she had in store for me. Trembling in horror, I thrust myself under the bed sheets, terrified of what might come next. A second bolt of lightning revealed Pop, who stood by the window, now wide open. Wind blasted in, lifting the curtains over the rails, spraying a torrent of rainwater across the room. The fury of the storm was overwhelming, but not for Mom and Pop, who stood there, unaffected by the wind, not a hair blown out of place. I peered out from under the bed covers at the open window across the room. Pop was there, beckoning me towards it, his thin fingers bending unnaturally towards the fate they had in store for me. It was clear what he wanted me to do, to leap out the second-story window to my death. Then I would be with them forever. God knows I tried to scream, but the very air had been crushed out of my lungs, lost to the terror that gripped me. I looked to Mom, perhaps hoping for mercy, but her eyes, once so radiant with love, now twinkled like those of a demented madman. I could take it no longer and shook my head, whispering with what little defiance I could muster, "No. No, Mom. Pop. I can't." I will never forget what happened next. Mom switched like a slide in a projector into a horror beyond imagination. She glided towards me, her eyes draining of color, her jaw unhinging to reveal a cavernous black hole, which emitted a shriek so terrifying that I covered my ears and dived back under the sheets. Through the thin fabric I could see them, illuminated by flashes of lightning as they circled my bed. before standing together at the foot of it, watching me. The commotion had alerted my father, who burst into the room, rushed straight to the window and slammed it shut. Close behind was Mother, who scooped me out of bed and rushed me downstairs. They had not seen Mom and Pop, who vanished the second my parents entered. I thought these events had taken minutes, but it seems I had been exposed to the elements for hours. I was freezing cold, and probably in shock. My father ran a hot bath while my mother prepared me a mug of hot chocolate. I was so out of it that I was almost catatonic. I remember Mother blowing on my hot chocolate to help cool it down, and then giving me small sips, so not to burn me. She stroked my hair and was so attentive and loving, but even with her, I thought she could change suddenly like Mom had. Perhaps this was a trick and they were just pretending to be my real parents. To feel so paranoid about the only ones you have left is the loneliest feeling in the world. Once the bath was ready, Father carried me upstairs, gently lowering me into the warm water. The heat of it came as a shock to my ice-cold bones. As steam filled the room, a sense of relief set in, or perhaps it was exhaustion. In the soothing water, I felt I could sleep for 100 years. They left the bathroom door half open, and I drew great comfort from the sound of their voices, even though they were discussing whether to call out the doctor. My behavior must have frightened them deeply. They must have wondered what had gone wrong with their boy. I wondered, too, what it was that I had done to deserve this and why Mom and Pop had chosen me. After a while, the humidity of the bathroom produced enough haze to obscure the door, which after a time I noticed was closed. I could still hear my parents outside, but then the sound of their voices too became faint, replaced eventually by silence. Our bathroom was small and narrow with tiled walls. The tiles were decorated with nautical pictures, ships and fish. Now obscured by the enveloping haze, the pictures, obscured as they were, appeared to change, and to the left and right of me were pictures of people, one on the left wall and the other on my right. Ships? No, and not sailors either. I recognized the face of Mom staring at me from the wall. Pop was on my right, both of them attached to the walls like wallpaper. The white pupils of their gray eyes were fixed squarely on mine, their expressionless faces bereft of humanity. Their skin and clothes were gray, drained of almost all their color. Before I could scream, Mom began to peel down the wall, her body curling until her head was upside down, her eyes never leaving me. Their necks stretched out, unnaturally long, as their faces leant closer and closer towards mine, their white eyes glowing like lost stars. I screamed, thrashing my arms and legs with all my might. My parents heard the noise and rushed to get into the bathroom, but found the door locked, latched shut from the inside. As they fought to smash their way in, another force was pinning my head under the bath water. I can remember shrieking as the water flooded my lungs, and my eyes burning as I fought to keep them open. Distorted by the rippling water, I could see their pale faces watching me die. They were smiling. The door collapsed from its hinges and my father dragged me out of the bath. I kicked and screamed, and no matter which room my parents took me to, all I could see when I opened my eyes were Mom and Pop staring at me, just inches away. As I waited for the doctor, I refused to open my eyes. Even then, I could still feel their presence close by, the prickling sensation of their breath on the nape of my neck. When the doctor arrived, I was whisked away to a local clinic where I received a psychological evaluation. I tried my best to explain what had happened, but how does a 7-year-old articulate a phenomenon such as this? My story was inevitably misinterpreted, and I was soon placed in protective social care, during which time I stayed with a number of foster parents. I saw many therapists who placed me on drugs that no child should endure, until finally, after a year, I was returned to my parents. By this time, they had moved out of town, after many in the local community suspected them of abusing me, whether spoken publicly or revealed by a judgmental look. Fortunately, I enjoyed a thoroughly ordinary adolescence, and I grew up with the usual fixations on video arcades and girls. During this time, I had come to believe that Mom and Pop were not real. but the manifestation of a breakdown brought about by the stress of my parents' marital problems and our move to a new town. It seemed reasonable to assume this, not only because my memories of my childhood were so clouded, but because so much of it was unfathomably surreal. The white faces that haunted me became as vague as a startling scene one might recall from a horror movie they'd watched years ago. In fact, I was so skeptical that I was quite unconcerned when, during a road trip with friends, we passed through my old hometown. I hadn't seen it since I was a child, and while I might have felt some trepidation, I was mostly curious about which diners were still open, and spared little thought for the monsters I'd consigned to childhood delusion. We passed through Main Street around dusk and made it to the suburbs close to my former home shortly after. The years had not been kind to the town, which had experienced some hard times since the closure of the factory. Those aspirational, middle-class homes, once adorned with clean white picket fences, were now half empty, with many sporting protective bars on their windows. I saw my old home loom towards us on the road. A strange instinct wanted me to stop, to make my friend turn the car around, but I fought it. After all, what did I have to fear now? Instead, I asked my friend to slow down, and the car crawled along the curb past my former home. The place looked decrepit, its rooms now empty with most windows broken and boarded up. It looked so tragic, in fact, that it looked almost disappointingly harmless, as if I had spent my time mythologizing whatever had occurred there in my childhood. I gave a sudden laugh, which surprised even myself. My friend grinned at me as he switched on the car radio and speeded up. As the music played, I smiled at the wing mirror, at the sight of my old home shrinking fast behind us. I felt on top of the world, and decided to turn around to give the place one last look before it vanished for good. No, it couldn't be. Two shapes, silhouetted by the sun, stood at my old bedroom window. I couldn't make out the shapes, but they looked like people. I could feel my stomach plummet with dread as I recalled Mom and Pop. Back then, I had even forgotten what I used to call them. As our car turned at the end of the street, I struggled to fight the nausea rising fast within me. My friend offered to stop the car, concerned that I might be sick, but I shouted at him, begged him in fact, to keep driving at all costs. He must have thought I was crazy, and I probably was. As the years rolled by, I became fixated with what I'd seen that day. Was it two figures by the window, or perhaps a trick of the light? Then, in a perverse irony, it was not Mom and Pop, whether real or not, that ended up ruining my life. I managed that all by myself. After college, I pursued a normal life. Anything that would prevent me from being alone with my thoughts and fears. Anything to prevent my loneliness. I settled down with the first woman who would marry me, rushed her to have kids, the works. I worked a normal job, a low-level white-collar position at a local manufacturer. I ended up hating my job, hating my wife, hating everything, but I couldn't leave them for fear of being alone with myself. Eventually, I was fired when the economy went south, after which I fell into a spell of heavy drinking. My wife did her best to help, but in the end, nobody could save me. She left, taking the kids with her to live on the West Coast, hundreds of miles from me. I'm glad she did for their sake and her own. Not long after my marriage fell apart, my parents passed away in a tragic road accident. I was truly alone, and I felt just as lonely as I had when I was a nervous kid, hiding upstairs in my room while my parents argued downstairs. One night, after a bout of heavy drinking, I made a pitiful and devastating realization. That I was a lost cause. Perhaps I'd always been, and yet nobody took away the pain of loneliness like Mom and Pop. In my unexceptional life, they had amounted to nothing but tedious mediocrity. Only they were truly exceptional, and remarkable though they were, they'd chosen me. I'm ignored by the world, and yet they were the ones to find something special and worthwhile in me. Mom and Pop. Now the red sky is black, and as my car rolls up to the front of my old childhood home, I know now what I must do. what I wasn't brave enough to do as a child. I stepped out of the car and looked up upon the derelict building before me. My old home is condemned for demolition, much like the rest of my abandoned hometown. I take the can of petrol from the boot of my car and look up to my old bedroom window. I can't see them yet, but I know they'll be waiting.